Hello. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. My reflection today is entitled A Commitment to Death. A Commitment to Death. You know, one of the most natural of human traditions is marriage. And in the Christian tradition, marriage is a covenant commitment between a man and a woman. But I don't think that there are any issues in this 21st century world that are pressing the church with as much force as those surrounding sex and marriage. We are living in a world which, for the most part, has succeeded in radically changing how our culture understands both sex and marriage. In recent decades, many who oppose the Christian view of marriage, the Christian tradition, have used selective and sometimes contradictory political, sociological, and scientific arguments to press the case for the radical reform of marriage. In fact, it's been something of a revolution. And those defending the traditional Christian institution of marriage, really, they've been on the losing side. In fact, I think it's too late to defend marriage. Rather than being defended, marriage needs to be taught and lived. And the church is the place where that teaching must be done. The church also should be the place that sustains couples in the struggle required to live it out. Unfortunately, the spiritual inheritance of the church has gifted it with all of the tools that it needs. And it is a struggle, to be sure, because there are a lot of people out there today who are just not interested in making a covenant commitment before God. They have chosen to do sex and relationship and family their own way. But for those who are willing to do it God's way, the church is where you will find what this sacred commitment is all about. You know, in times gone by, marriage laws were once the legal framework of a Christian culture. For centuries, the general framework of marriage remained untouched. The church in many countries played an important role in upholding the Christian ideal of marriage. Marriage as an institution was never traditionally about romantic love and physical attraction. That's the emphasis of the culture today. Marriage over time in centuries gone by was about fidelity and stability and paternity and duty towards your family. You know, I've had the privilege of bringing together many couples in marriage, and I never ask a couple, you know, do you love him? Do you love her? I simply ask, do you promise to love? And that simple promise is only one of a number of things. If I think of the vows, I'm like, do you take this woman to be your wedded wife, to live together in accordance with God's ordinance in this holy estate of matrimony? You know, will you love her, comfort her, honor her, and keep her in sickness and in health? And forsaking all others, will you be true only to her, so long as you both shall live? You know, or I take you to be my wedded husband, you know, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, and for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until we are parted by death. And so as I think about those vows, obviously the primary intent of those promises is faithfulness in all circumstances over the course of an entire lifetime. So in years gone by, the laws that surrounded marriage existed to enforce those promises and to make it difficult to do otherwise. So divorce was something that was not that easy to obtain. In fact, churches made remarriage quite difficult. Obligations to children were very well defined and grounded in parental rights and obligations. The whole legal framework for family law tilted the culture towards marriage. And of course, none of this would have been of any benefit if it didn't reflect the cultural consensus of the day. So, in a way, morality was legislated. But moral laws are simply experienced as oppression if they do not generally agree with the moral consensus of the culture. And for centuries, the laws upholding marriage were at the consent of the culture, right? So people felt that those laws were inherently correct. But towards the end of the last century, that moral consensus governing marriage began to dissolve. And there were a whole lot of causes that contributed to that breakdown. But inevitably, the laws governing marriage began to change. And these changes in marriage law have been accompanied by an evolution in the cultural meaning of marriage. Right? So from a bond of permanent union between a man and a woman, marriage has morphed into a contractual agreement between two people for their own self-defined ends. And so premarital sex and sex outside of marriage and same-sex relationships no longer carry a negative view from the culture, where once it did. And so those are clear reasons for why a defense of marriage it's simply too late. You know, traditional Christian marriage in our world is seen as old-fashioned and out of date. But that does not mean that Christian tradition is wrong. It doesn't mean that Christian tradition in any way is incorrect. Marriage remains one of the most natural of human traditions. In fact, the remnants of traditional Christian marriage are still there. Most people in a relationship imagine that relationship will go for a lifetime. Even same-sex relationships profess a desire for a lifelong commitment. But the sentiments surrounding lifelong commitments are just that. They're sentiments. And that's kind of the stuff of, fairy tales. It's like, living happily ever after. Classical Christian marriage is one of commitment. It is a commitment to death. It is faithfulness over the course of a lifetime. That's what it means to love someone. And no Christian government or Christian laws can force people to do this. It's only in a life surrendered to Christ that a lifelong union can understand the virtues that are required to live out that commitment in marriage. Virtues of patience, endurance, sacrifice, selflessness, generosity, kindness, steadfastness, loyalty. These things are impossible without the presence of real commitment. And as for the world around us, well, in the absence of stable, lifelong, self-sacrificing marriages, the world around us will remain a world of chaos and dysfunction. Believe me, no amount of legislation or social programming is going to, succeed when it comes to trying to replace the most natural of human traditions, marriage. None of that stuff's going to change anything. The social corrosion, domestic violence, births outside of marriage, the confusion, the hurt, the pain is only going to continue. Forgiveness, grace, and restoration comes by turning to the way of God. It's the only way to counter a broken world. And we do that in our churches and we do it in our marriages. Every day that you endure, every day that you succeed in a faithful union to your spouse and to your children, it's a heroic act of grace-filled living. May God be with you as you determine to live for Him. May God be with you as you determine to follow Him. And may God be with you as you determine to do things His way.